Hello and welcome to the Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. Today we're going to be talking about a text that's written from my current favorite philosopher. My favorite philosopher used to be Henry David Thoreau, and I still love Walden. That's still my favorite book of all time, written by Thoreau. But I've really been digging this philosopher's philosophy. Really been digging this philosopher because she is taking philosophy where it needs to go. And it needs to go toward social justice. Because I really do believe that that's the challenge of humanity. That's why human beings cannot reach their full potential. That is truly what's blocking human progress. Our inability as a species to be socially just across the board. To provide social equity to all people. Because of that, we hit this limit, this boundary that we can't overcome. And I do believe philosophy is the way we need to start approaching this problem. And Judith Butler is using that. She's utilizing philosophy as a tool, as a mechanism to create or develop or analyze solutions to the problems of social injustice. And that philosopher I'm talking about is Judith Butler. And we're going to be talking about her book. Whoa, it's so red. Let's see. Oh, here we go. It's called Frames of War. When is Life Grievable? Now, this text is a collection of essays written over a few years time span. And it doesn't have one main central theme. It has a few different themes overall. But in general, it is about humanity's understanding of the ontology of life. What does it mean to exist? Well, that depends on how existence is framed. And Judith Butler argues that we're always putting people's lives in boxes, or we're framing people's existence. And that framing is how we interpret the meaning behind different lives, which in many cases is false. She talks about how certain lives are grievable when certain people die. People go in uproar and they care a lot and it's unacceptable. But then when other people die or they suffer tremendously, it's acceptable. It's okay. Those lives don't become grievable. And war is an example of that, where there are just wars and there are unjust wars. And in some cases, killing is justified and certain lives have to go away because it's for the greater cause, right? And the lives that are killed, even civilian lives, even innocent lives, they become instruments of war and they lose their grievability. But it's not just war, it's all types of various social contexts. Judith Butler really goes deep into that. But what I want to talk about is a topic that she brought up that really spoke to me or sparked my interest, because I've been having these debates on YouTube via the comments section. And I said it before, I'll say it again. I love debating. It's just a thing that I just enjoy very much. So often you might see, if you have a disagreement, I'm gonna defend my position because that's just something I like to do. I even have my YouTube account set up on my phone where if you comment, it's like getting a text message. So it's like when you comment, I get the notification immediately. So if you got a disagreement, you better bring it, is what I'm trying to say. No, I mean, it's all good. We're not, I have fun debating. Even when it's about really serious things like religion or war or something like that, or human rights. The problem is you might comment and I'll be at the grocery store, so I just don't have the time to address all like 8 or 10 of your points and write a thesis statement about it. But I'll go back and forth with you. But a very common debate I get into on YouTube is the whole religious versus atheistic debate. The whole, is religion evil, or is religion archaic? Is agnosticism, atheism where humanity is heading? Is this the way? Is human progress going away from religion and toward more secular, agnostic, atheistic points of view? I've gotten into that debate many times on the channel via the comment section, and I love that debate because it gives me an opportunity to express my Christianity in ways that aren't normally expressed in mainstream media. But also, Judith Butler has a few things to say about religion and modernity and even religious intolerance. Let me read you some passages. So this is from the essay, Sexual Politics, Torture, and Secular Time. It's the third essay in this collection. In this quote, in this essay, Judith Butler is discussing anti-Islamic sentiment and conduct. That's what's happening in today's world. This demonization of Muslim people, the belief system of Islam, this notion that religions like that are archaic, they're old, they're past. It's kind of almost like a barbaric form of belief, and that human modernization, as we move forward in time, human beings should move past these Islamic belief systems. Human progress is actually the going away from that. That whole sentiment, that whole idea that's happening right now. So Judith Butler talks about that sentiment with this quote. Something more fundamental is occurring, namely that liberal freedoms are now being understood to rely upon a hegemonic culture, one that is called modernity, and that relies on a certain progressive account of increasing freedoms. This uncritical domain of culture, functioning as a precondition for liberal freedom, in turn becomes a cultural basis for sanctioning forms of cultural and religious hatred and objection. My point is not to trade sexual freedoms for religious ones, but rather to question the framework that assumes there can be no political analysis that tries to analyze homophobia and racism in ways that move beyond this antinomy of liberalism. Now, this is a very interesting quote, I find, because what I'm thinking is you could take anything to the extreme, anything, where it becomes just too much. I'm talking extreme to the point where it just becomes illogical, unreasonable, and even unjust, immoral. I consider myself a very liberal person. I guess you want to categorize me in that nature. Sure, I'm probably more liberal than conservative if you're going to use that scale. But liberalism, take it to the extreme, can be bad. Just like anything. Conservatism, take it to the extreme, can be bad. And we're talking about liberalism taken to the extreme, right? Because there's a liberal argument that's starting to develop in current affairs that modernity, modern society, is better than past society, right? As we progress further along, we become better as a human society. That's just a given, right? And that belief systems of the past are not modern, they're old. Therefore, they harken back to days when humanity was savage or barbaric or underdeveloped. And then we need to do away with them. This liberal argument that modernism, modernity, is what we need to head for. And that's a given, right? But that's not necessarily true. As we move forward in history, as we keep moving in toward the future, it is not necessarily the case that we are becoming more just as a society, that our civilization is progressing into a better mode of existence. We can't just accept that as a given. And we can't just accept that certain old belief systems and old viewpoints are bad right off the bat just because they are from the past. That type of ideology, that type of reasoning, rationale, it opens up the floodgates for anti-religious sentiment or discrimination based off of religion alone. I read you this quote. That power relies on a certain taken for granted notion of historical progress to legitimate itself as an ultimately modern achievement. That power referring to the power of secular institutions to discriminate against religious minorities like Muslim communities. That kind of power is based off of this notion that as we progress further in history, as we move forward, we are automatically achieving, automatically, just by the act of progressing, and that we need to do away with old ways of thinking. So let's talk about old ways of thinking, or like religion. When you read religious texts like the Bible or the Quran or other religious texts, and you read quotes and texts that refer to times that have since long gone, or practices that are no longer applicable to today's society. How do you deal with that? How do you come to terms with that? How do you understand that? Here's what Judith Butler says. Here's another quote. Consider that religion is not simply a set of beliefs or a set of dogmatic views, but a matrix for subject formation whose final form is not determined in advance. A discursive matrix for the articulation and stipulation of values and a field of contestation. So consider religion more like an enterprise. Similarly, like the enterprise of philosophy or the enterprise of science. It's more like a framework, a mode of operations. Like you have a set of functions that you input variables in, and then variables go out. Depending on your particular way of being, who you are, your individual attributes, you might take the framework of religion and act differently than somebody else. But you have that common framework to work within. There's some parts of the framework you might put a large priority on. And then there's other aspects within that framework you might put little priority toward or dismiss completely. Similarly to how a scientist focuses on one aspect of their study while not focusing on other disciplines. But still using that same framework, the scientific method, for instance, a scientist might do an experiment, right, for example, and come out with a conclusion to that experiment, a result, and based off of that result, come up with a new theory. And then that theory might be contested by different scientists. Likewise, a religious person or different religious people might have an experience that happens to them or encounters real world experiences in the world, and then applies the religious teachings and values and lessons, come out with a result, and then develop their own theory based off of that result. And there could be many different theories or modes of being based off of that result. And that's why you have all different kinds of religious people. You have liberal religious people, you have extremely conservative religious people, you have the evangelicals, you have Catholics, you have Protestants, you have Sunnis, you have Shias, even within different East Asian religions like Hinduism. There's various different practices within Hinduism. Many Hindus really focus on the divine aspect with the gods like Shiva and Vishnu. Other Hindus specifically focus on the philosophical aspect of Hinduism and don't really focus heavily on the deities of Hinduism and just focus on the philosophical implications of Hinduism. This idea that we are just one existence. And that's all that some particular Hindus focus on. Just because you're a religious person doesn't necessitate that you believe in this, and this, right? There's variables depending on who you are as a person and where you're raised and where you're from and how you study and practice your religion. So let me read you this quote. And this quote is from the essay, Non-Thinking and the Normative. And here Judith Butler is analyzing sexual identities or orientations with religious belief, particularly Islamic belief. The homosexual person at issue may or may not be Muslim, and the Muslim person at issue may or may not be homophobic. But if the framework of the cultural conflict, gay versus Muslim, determines how we conceive of those identities, then the Muslim becomes defined by his or her ostensible homophobia, and the homosexual becomes defined depending on the framework, either as presumptively anti-Muslim or fearful of Muslim homophobia. In other words, both positions get defined in terms of their putatively conflictual relation with one another, at which point we come to know very little about either category or the sites of their sociological convergence. Indeed, the framework of tolerance, even the injunction to tolerance, orders identity according to its requirements and effaces the complex cultural realities of gay and religious lives. Basically, Judith Butler is saying, don't fall into that trap. You see a Muslim person, you immediately think like, oh, this person is homophobic because they're Muslim. Because Muslims do not accept homosexuality, and that's something they hate tremendously, right? You just make this assumption immediately, and then you start developing all these conclusions based off of that initial assumption without really taking the time to understand and getting to know Muslim people or gay people within the Muslim community, or asking Muslim people, what do you think about gay people? Right? You never actually took the time to do that. You just assumed right off the bat that this is the case, and it puts you in this false framework. And society does that. Society puts us in these boxes, these false realities, and we're constantly at odds with each other because we make all these assumptions, because we're basing our relationships off of antagonisms that may or may not exist. Oftentimes they don't exist. Let me continue with this other quote. To say that there are rules against homosexuality within Islam is not yet to say how people live in relation to such rules or taboos, or how such rules and taboos vary in their intensity or centrality depending on the specific religious context and practices at issue. And again, just take the time, talk to a religious person, talk to a gay person, get to know them. Don't make assumptions based specifically off of the religious rules alone. Understand the cultural context of a person. Understand how society influences that person, or the societal context of where we're at. You can't make assumptions without first considering the social, cultural influence that's going on, that's happening. Take the time to also consider that context, because that means a lot. That social or cultural context could take priority, precedent over the religious rule set, the religious framework. You can't consider the framework without considering where that frame is being set up, and how that frame is being set up, and in what ways that frame is being used and interpreted. These are all things that we need to consider. So take heed. Modernity doesn't necessarily equal progress. Religion doesn't necessarily equal barbarism or an archaic mode of thinking. Not necessarily. It can. It most certainly can, and you do see that in history. But you also see very progressive concepts and ideologies developed from old religious frameworks. So take that in consideration. I recommend Judith Butler, Frames of War. When is life grievable? Well, you've been watching The Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.